The big call from the Prime Minister late on Friday night in the face of Cyclone Alfred.
I can clearly say that my focus is certainly not on votes, it's on people and it's on Australians at this difficult time, and I won't be doing anything to distract from that.
Those comments, of course, mean we're now looking at a May election, forcing Labor to deliver a federal budget on the 25th of March. For more on this and the other big stories today, I'm joined now by our Sky News contributor, Chris Uhlmann. Chris, I think Labor campaign boss Paul Erickson would have preferred the PM wait until Sunday to see how the cyclone played out. We know, of course, it was downgraded once it hit shoreline. It was ex-tropical cyclone Alfred by then, before he made that decision to not to visit the Governor-General over the weekend. But he blinked. He's now snookered in the sense we've got Anzac Day, we've got Easter, so it will be a May election, and he's got no more cards to play here, has he?
Not on that front, so we know it's going to be a May election, so that's ruled out. That's one of the advantages the government always has of deciding the date of the election. I don't know whether that helped in one way or the other, really, but up his sleeve he has the sorts of things that you're talking about. With that budget coming up, expect to see that there will be cost of living relief, and people have to be really clear about this. If there is another $300 doled out by the federal government to help cover your electricity bill, that will be $600 the government has doled out when it said the price was going to drop on 2022 prices by $275. So they're recycling taxpayers' money back into the pockets of consumers, every consumer in the land. So someone like me who does reasonably well will be getting the same $300 that someone on a pension who can't afford to have solar panels on their roof or batteries, they'll be getting the same amount of money. So people need to realise that this lipstick on a pig of a policy has to be called out, that the precise opposite of what was promised is actually happening. So if that's dressed up as a cost of living relief, I would expect all the journalists to be saying, where's the $275? And by the way, when will power prices ever fall under the policies that you're delivering?
I made the point at the top of the show, there's a whole lot of things that are material to the setting of power prices, like the 2035 targets due in February. We're not going to see them. Like the default market offer that should be on the table almost imminently. I suspect we won't see that. Like wind farm approvals, they've been duck-shoved away. Like there's a whole lot of stuff here the government's pretending won't happen until obviously after the election. If returned, it will. And then I saw and mentioned at the top of the show too, I mean, the new Prime Minister of Canada saying the first thing he'll do is scrap their carbon tax. We seem in Australia to be in a parallel universe compared to the United States, compared to Britain, compared now even to left-wing Canada. And we're going down the path of net zero, and everybody else is desperately trying to avert course.
Yeah, and you're dead right, Peter. So if you start to add them up, so China has never been doing net zero, Russia has never been doing net zero, India has never been doing net zero, the United States has now pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords and it is not doing net zero. Add all that up and you get 60% of the world's emissions. We are 1%. So what on earth is Australia doing? Because nothing that we do here will have an effect on cutting carbon emissions globally. So you would think that it would be time for a rethink. However, I doubt that will happen here. I think things come slowly to Australia. Certainly messages come slowly to Australia, because if you looked at what's happened in Germany and at what's happened in the UK and what's happened in California, you would see that everywhere where you deploy large-scale wind and solar and it rises to become one of the dominant forces of generations, two things happen. Your grid becomes weaker and the price of electricity goes through the roof. That is true everywhere, and it's now proving to be true here.
Chris, news poll today, 2PP still in favour of the coalition. They are ahead of Labor. There's been a little uptick in the Prime Minister's personal rating, but the party's still in deep trouble. On these numbers, it would absolutely be a hung parliament. I'm curious for your take here. This extra time the PM's given himself to go out there and have the election in May, given the trend to date, you know, the longer the Prime Minister's been out there campaigning since The Voice, the more his numbers have declined, the more the trend has gone against Labor. Will the extra time work for him or against him?
Well, events do play into this, and this event of the cyclone means it's an unforced change, and it may well be that the extra time does help him. I see a YouGov poll that was out not so long ago that showed a 3-point turnaround in Labor's fortune. So if that was started to be replicated elsewhere, that would be interesting. And if you look at those news poll numbers that you were talking about today, yeah, if looking over them, you could say that there's a 3-point swing towards the coalition over the last 3 years. Or it could be nothing because there's a 3-point margin of error. We look at those poll numbers today on primary votes. The Labor Party's on 32. It was on 32.7 at the last election. 3 points plus or minus. Well, it could be 3 points better than that. The Liberal Party's on 39. Well, it was 36.7 at the last election or thereabouts. Again, 3 points plus or minus. If it's minus, there might not have been any change since the last election. So I think I've always thought the most likely outcome of the next election, based on the gap that Peter Dutton and the coalition has to bridge, is a minority Labor government. And they don't have to sign a deal with the Teals or the Greens, but they would be pulled to the left by the weight on the crossbench of the Teals and the Greens, and it would look like the Senate would be more left-wing. So that would be the outcome of the election, and that may well be a much worse proposition for the Australian people.
I think the biggest problem Albanese has, and I wrote about this yesterday, is he doesn't have an incoming government's buffer. I mean, John Howard had something like 94 seats in 1996 when he came in from opposition. Tony Abbott had 90 seats coming in 2013. Kevin Rudd, Kevin 07, somewhere in the mid-80s. Well, this bloke's only got 77 seats. I mean, he's only just formed government in his own right. He's got no seats to lose. And I'm going to get into WA in a moment with Cos Samaras, but yes, there was a strong return there for the government, but in part, that was the McGowan landslide. In some seats, there was a 20% swing against Labor. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment, and I'd want to see the next news poll before I started to think there was some green shoots here for Labor.
Yeah, and time will tell, obviously, and I'd want to see the results on election night because that's where all the rubber actually hits the road. But, you know, if you're Anthony Albanese at the moment, I know that he is really quite confident about where he sits. Well, maybe that is, you'd think if he's not going to be confident, then nobody would be. But I do think that what we've seen now, and what's the real story of the last several elections, it's the collapse in the primary vote of both major parties, the rise in the crossbench. And so the major parties are now fighting for the scraps on either side of the crossbench. Now, without much change on the crossbench next time around, it puts both of them in a very difficult position in trying to form government.